Tanya Williams stood frozen at her apartment door, the white paper in her hand shaking slightly. The eviction notice had come without warning on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Outside, the leaves were changing colors, but inside apartment 4B, everything suddenly felt cold and gray. 30 days to vacate the premises, she read again, hoping the words might somehow change. They didn't. Tanya had lived in this two-bedroom apartment with her son Marcus for almost 3 years. She worked as a nurse's aide at the local hospital, taking night shifts so she could see Marcus off to school each morning. Never once had she missed a rent payment. In fact, she often paid early. 10-year-old Marcus looked up from his homework at the kitchen table. He was smart enough to read his mother's expression. "What's wrong, Mom?" Tanya tried to smile, but couldn't quite manage it. "Nothing you need to worry about right now, baby. Finish your math." But Marcus knew better. He had grown used to reading his mother's face when things were tight. He knew when the power bill was high or when the car needed repairs they couldn't afford. This look was different. This was fear. The next morning, Tanya requested to speak with Mr. Caldwell, the landlord who owned their building and several others in town. Richard Caldwell was a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and expensive clothes. He owned half the rental properties in the eastern part of town. "I don't understand," Tanya said, standing in Caldwell's office. "We've never been late with rent. Marcus is quiet. We keep the place clean. Why are you evicting us?" Caldwell barely looked up from his desk. "Business decision. Nothing personal. I'm renovating several units." "But why our unit? We've been good tenants. Could we maybe move to another apartment in one of your buildings?" Caldwell shuffled some papers. "Nothing available. 30 days is standard notice. It's all legal." Tanya noticed he wouldn't look her in the eyes. "Is there something else? Has there been a complaint?" "No complaints," Caldwell said flatly. "Just business. If you want your security deposit back, the place needs to be spotless." As Tanya walked home, she passed Mrs. Rivera, an elderly woman who lived in the building next door, also owned by Caldwell. "Did you get one too?" Mrs. Rivera asked, holding up a similar white paper. "An eviction notice?" "Yes," Tanya replied. "The Johnsons got one last week," Mrs. Rivera said. "And the Davis family the week before. All of us, good tenants for years." Tanya looked around. The Riveras, the Johnsons, the Davis family. All black or Hispanic families. Something cold settled in her stomach. That night, after Marcus went to bed, Tanya sat at the kitchen table with bills spread out before her. Finding a new place would mean a new security deposit, first and last month's rent, moving costs. Money she didn't have. She'd been saving for Marcus's school supplies and winter clothes. From his bedroom, Marcus watched through the cracked door as his mother wiped tears from her eyes. He had never seen her cry before. She always told him they were strong, that they could handle anything together. But tonight, she looked broken. Marcus slipped back to bed, something new burning inside him. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but he knew it wasn't right. At 10 years old, he made a promise to himself in the darkness of his room. Someday, somehow, you would make sure no one ever made his mother cry like that again. The next week passed in a blur for Tanya. Every evening after work, she searched online for affordable apartments, called landlords, and filled out applications. Each call ended the same way: nothing available, or the rent was too high. Marcus noticed his mother's growing worry. He had always been observant for a 10-year-old, picking up on things adults thought went over his head. One evening, he found Tanya sitting on the couch, staring at her phone. "Any luck finding a new place?" he asked quietly. Tanya quickly wiped her eyes. "Not yet, baby, but something will come up soon." On Saturday morning, Tanya took Marcus to the laundromat. While their clothes tumbled in the dryers, she spotted Janet Davis folding clothes nearby. The Davis family had lived in one of Caldwell's buildings until last month. "I heard you got evicted too," Janet said, lowering her voice. "Same story about renovations?" Tanya nodded. "Did he actually renovate your building?" Janet shook her head. "New tenants moved in 3 days after we left. White couple, no renovations." "That doesn't make sense," Tanya frowned. "Did you ever have problems with Caldwell before?" "Not directly," Janet replied. "But my husband overheard something last year. He was dropping off our rent check when Caldwell was talking to someone in his office." Door was cracked open. He heard Caldwell say he was working on changing the neighborhood profile. Said property values would go up once he improved the tenant's situation. A cold feeling settled in Tanya's stomach. You think he meant? I know exactly what he meant, Janet said firmly. The Riveras got evicted too, right? And the Johnsons? Notice anything about who's getting pushed out? Marcus, who had been pretending to read a comic book nearby, listened carefully. He might be young, but he understood what they were saying. His teacher had talked about discrimination in history class. He hadn't realized it still happened like this. The next day, Tanya visited her friend Letitia, who worked at the housing authority. Letitia couldn't offer much hope. You could file a discrimination complaint, Letitia explained, but these cases take months, sometimes years. You need proof it was racial discrimination, not just a business decision. And Caldwell's careful, he knows the law. I can't wait years, Tanya said. I need a place to live now. I know, Letitia nodded sympathetically. Let me make some calls. My cousin has a smaller apartment on the east side. It's further from Marcus's school, but the rent's decent. On the bus ride home, Tanya stared out the window, thinking about what Janet had said. As they passed Caldwell's office building, Marcus suddenly spoke up. Mom, why is Mr. Caldwell making us leave when we didn't do anything wrong? Tanya chose her words carefully. Sometimes people make decisions based on what they think about others without knowing them. It's not fair, but it happens. Because we're black? Marcus asked directly. Tanya looked into her son's eyes, seeing understanding beyond his years. She wouldn't lie to him. I think that might be part of it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. My teacher says that's illegal. It is, but it's also hard to prove. Later that week, Tanya signed a lease for the apartment Letitia's cousin owned. It was smaller than their current place, with a longer commute to both work and school. The rent was slightly higher too, stretching their already tight budget. As they packed their belongings, Marcus carefully wrapped his books and the science award he won last year. Each item went into boxes labeled in his neat handwriting. He worked silently, methodically, his young mind turning over everything he'd learned this past week. When Tanya wasn't looking, he took one of her business cards from the kitchen drawer, the ones with Caldwell's company information printed on them. He tucked it into his notebook, between pages of math problems. This wasn't over, he decided. Not by a long shot. The Williams' new apartment was on the third floor of an older building without an elevator. The pipes knocked in the walls at night, and the kitchen was barely big enough for their small table. But it was clean, and the landlord seemed fair. Most importantly, it was theirs, at least for now. It's not so bad, Tanya said brightly as they arranged Marcus's bed against the wall of his new, much smaller bedroom. The space was so tight that his desk had to go in the living room. We can make this work. Marcus nodded but said little. He had been unusually quiet since the move. Tanya worried about him, but she was too exhausted from working extra shifts to cover the moving costs to press him about it. The first day at his new school, Marcus sat alone at lunch. The other kids stared at the new boy but didn't approach. He didn't mind. He had more important things to think about than making friends right away. That evening, while his mother showered after her long hospital shift, Marcus pulled out a notebook. On the cover, he had written, "Important plans." Inside, he began listing everything he knew about Mr. Caldwell and what had happened to them. His fourth-grade teacher, Ms. Powell, had told them that writing things down helped make sense of problems. So he wrote, 1. Mr. Caldwell kicked us out because of how we look. 2. Other black families were kicked out too. 3. This is against the law. 4. Proving it is hard. Marcus chewed his pencil, thinking hard. What could a 10-year-old do about this problem? He turned to a fresh page and wrote a new heading, What I Need to Learn. Under it, he listed how laws work, how to prove someone is doing bad things, how to help Mom. He'd heard the shower turn off and quickly tucked the notebook under his mattress. In the weeks that followed, Marcus spent every free moment in the school library. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, noticed his sudden interest in unusual books for a fourth grader. That's some heavy reading, she commented one day, seeing him with a simplified book about civil rights history. School project. Kind of, Marcus replied. It's a personal project. Mrs. Chen studied him for a moment, then nodded. Let me know if you need help finding anything specific. At home, Tanya noticed changes in her son. He was more serious, more focused on his schoolwork. His teachers called her in for a conference, not because of problems, but because they were impressed by his sudden academic intensity. Marcus has always been bright, his math teacher explained, but lately he's been asking for extra work, especially word problems involving money calculations and percentages. It's unusual for his age. Tanya was proud but puzzled. That night, she found Marcus at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers covered in careful handwriting. "What's all this, baby?" she asked. Marcus quickly gathered his papers. "Just homework, Mom." "Your teachers say you're doing extra credit in every class." He shrugged. "I just want to learn more." Tanya sat beside him, taking his small hand in hers. "Is this about the move? About Mr. Caldwell?" Something flashed in Marcus's eyes, but he shook his head. "I just want to do well in school. For you." Later that night, after Tanya had fallen asleep on the couch, too tired to even make it to her bed, Marcus crept to the window. From their apartment, he could see part of downtown, where Caldwell's office building stood among the taller structures. One day, he whispered to himself, "I'm going to make things right." He returned to his room and pulled out his notebook. On a fresh page, he wrote down his plan for the future. It wasn't the scattered thoughts of a child, but a roadmap laid out with surprising clarity. 1. Get the best grades in school. 2. Learn about laws and rights. 3. Go to college. 4. Become someone who can fight back. At the bottom of the page, he wrote in large letters, "Promised and Amon." Marcus didn't know exactly how yet, but someday, Richard Caldwell would learn that the little boy he had helped displace had not forgotten, and would not forget. 7 years passed quickly. Marcus Williams was no longer the quiet 10-year-old boy who had moved into the small apartment with his mother. At 17, he had grown tall and confident, with a focus that impressed everyone around him. "You got another letter," Tanya called out one afternoon as she sorted through the mail. Her voice held the mixture of pride and amazement that had become common these past few months. Marcus took the thick envelope from her hands. Princeton University. He added it to the growing stack on his desk. Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Columbia, all offering scholarships. "That's 5 now," Tanya said, shaking her head in wonder. "My boy, going to an Ivy League school." Marcus smiled but said nothing. His eyes drifted to the bottom drawer of his desk, where his old important Pelan's notebook was kept. Over the years, it had been joined by more notebooks, newspaper clippings, and printouts about housing discrimination laws. Marcus had never forgotten their eviction, but he had learned to channel that memory into determination instead of anger. He had become president of his high school's debate team, editor of the school newspaper, and finished at the top of his class. "Have you decided which one you'll pick?" Tanya asked. "Harvard," Marcus answered without hesitation. "They have the best law program." Law had been his goal since 7th grade, when a civil rights attorney had spoken at his school. That day, Marcus had added a new line to his plan: "Become a lawyer who helps people like us." Every summer during high school, Marcus had worked part-time jobs, first at the grocery store, then at the library, and finally as an intern at a local law firm, filing papers and making copies. The pay wasn't much, but he saved every dollar to help his mother and prepare for college. Tanya had finally received her nursing degree after years of night classes. Their apartment was still small, but they had made it home. Pictures of Marcus receiving awards lined the walls, along with Tanya's nursing graduation photo. They had survived, even thrived, but neither had forgotten what brought them here. One evening, as Marcus researched housing discrimination cases online, a familiar name caught his eye. Richard Caldwell Properties was expanding, now owning buildings in 3 counties. According to the article, Caldwell was being praised for neighborhood improvement initiatives that had increased property values throughout the region. Marcus printed the article and added it to his files. His jaw tightened as he read how Caldwell described himself as committed to community development. The article mentioned nothing about the families displaced by his improvements. "Still at it?" Tanya asked, bringing him a cup of tea. "Just some research," Marcus replied, closing the webpage. Tanya glanced at the article but said nothing. She had long suspected that Marcus's interest in law had something to do with their eviction years ago, but she never pushed. Her son had turned pain into purpose, and she couldn't be more proud. "I ran into Mrs. Davis at the hospital today," she said instead. "Her daughter just had a baby." "The Devises who were evicted from Caldwell's building right before us?" Marcus asked, his attention suddenly sharp. Tanya nodded. "Janet said they're still in that same apartment across town. Rent keeps going up, but they manage." Marcus made a mental note to add the Davises to his growing list of former Caldwell tenants. Over the years, he had secretly collected names, dates, and stories whenever possible. That night, alone in his room, Marcus updated his plan. Harvard was now a certainty. After that would come law school, and then... He paused, pen hovering over the page. What exactly did he want? Revenge? Justice? Both? He finally wrote, "Make sure it never happens again. To anyone." 3 months later, Marcus stood in his graduation robes, valedictorian of his class. From the podium, he looked out at the crowd and found his mother's face, beaming with tears in her eyes. "The future belongs to those who prepare for it," he said into the microphone, "and some of us have been preparing for a very long time." In the audience, Tanya knew exactly what he meant. Her son had been preparing for this moment, and what would come after, since he was 10 years old. 12 years after the eviction that changed their lives, Marcus Williams drove through the streets of his hometown. The familiar buildings looked smaller somehow, though many had been renovated or replaced entirely. New coffee shops and boutiques lined streets that once held family-owned markets and repair shops. Marcus adjusted his tie as he stopped at a red light. At 22, he had finished college in just 3 years, graduating at the top of his class from Harvard. His law degree had come next, followed by a prestigious clerkship. Now, at 22, he was returning home as the newest attorney at Johnson, Rivera and Associates, a civil rights law firm specializing in housing discrimination. The firm's name brought a small smile to his face. Mary Rivera was the daughter of the elderly woman who had been evicted alongside Marcus's family years ago. She had founded the firm after her own battle with housing discrimination. As Marcus parked outside the modest office building, his phone rang. "Are you there yet?" Tanya's excited voice came through the speaker. "Just arrived," Marcus replied. "First day on the job." "I'm so proud of you, baby," she said, her voice catching slightly. "You did it. You really did it." Marcus looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror, straightening his tie one last time. "Not yet, Mom, but I will." The firm was small but busy. Mary Rivera, now in her 50s, greeted Marcus with a warm handshake and knowing eyes. "Your resume is impressive," she said, leading him to a small office now bearing his name on the door. "But what impressed me most was your personal statement. Not many young lawyers are so focused." Marcus nodded. They both knew what had driven him to this career, to this particular firm. No words were needed. "I have your first assignment," Mary continued, placing a file on his desk. "We're gathering data on rental properties throughout the county. Eviction rates, tenant demographics, rent increases. See what patterns you can find." Marcus opened the file, already knowing what he would discover. "Any particular property owners I should focus on?" Mary's expression remained neutral, but her eyes held understanding. "All the major ones, including Caldwell Properties, which is rebranded as CalStar Development since Richard Caldwell's son took over 3 years ago." Marcus kept his face professional, though his heart raced at the name. Rebranded? Interesting. "Same practices, new name," Mary replied. "But proving discrimination requires data, not assumptions." For the next 3 weeks, Marcus worked methodically, compiling records and statistics. He created spreadsheets tracking eviction notices across the city, overlaid with census data showing neighborhood demographics. The pattern was clear, but still circumstantial. One evening, as Marcus worked late, the cleaning woman entered his office. "Sorry to disturb you," she said, pausing with her vacuum. "I can come back." Marcus looked up to decline, then froze. "Mrs. Johnson?" The older woman squinted at him. "Do I know you?" "I'm Tanya Williams's son. We lived in the same building as you before." Recognition dawned on her face. "Little Marcus. My word, look at you now. A lawyer." Mrs. Johnson sat down, forgetting about her cleaning duties. "You know, they did the same thing to 6 more families last year. Same pattern. Same excuse about renovations. Marcus leaned forward. Would you be willing to make a statement about what happened to your family? After all these years, would it even matter? It might, Marcus said, his voice firm, especially if we can show it's still happening. That weekend, Marcus drove to the building where he and his mother had once lived. It looked different now. Fresh paint, new windows, a security system at the entrance. The rent, he knew from his research, had tripled. As he stood looking up at their old apartment, a white SUV pulled up to the curb. A man stepped out, younger than Marcus remembered, but unmistakably Richard Caldwell's son, now running the family business. Their eyes met briefly across the street. The younger Caldwell gave a polite nod to the well-dressed black man he assumed was looking to rent, then walked into the building, unaware that he had just nodded to his company's worst nightmare. Marcus smiled slightly as he returned to his car. Phase 1 of his long-planned mission was officially underway. Marcus's office walls gradually transformed over the next 4 months. Maps of the city hung with colored pins marking properties owned by Caldstar Development. Next to them, charts displayed eviction rates by neighborhood, with clear patterns emerging. Red strings connected photos of former tenants to their old buildings, creating a web of displacement that couldn't be coincidence. This is impressive, Mary Rivera said one morning, studying the visual display. But will it be enough for court? Marcus turned from his computer. Not yet. We need internal documents showing intent. Statistics prove correlation, not discrimination. And how do you plan to get those? Mary asked, though she already suspected the answer. I've identified 17 former employees of Caldwell Properties, Marcus replied. 3 have agreed to talk. The first interview took place that afternoon in a small coffee shop across town. Jasmine Baker had worked as a leasing agent for Caldwell for 3 years before quitting. She nervously stirred her latte as Marcus recorded their conversation. There was never anything in writing, she explained, her voice low. But we had procedures. When certain types of people applied, we were told to say units were already promised to someone else. Certain types, Marcus prompted. Black families, Hispanic applicants, single mothers, Jasmine replied, looking ashamed. Richard would review applications personally and mark some with a small X in the corner. Those were automatic rejections. And for existing tenants? The renovations excuse was standard, but only for certain buildings, certain units. The ones he wanted to upgrade. By upgrade, Marcus knew she meant make white. He kept his expression neutral as he took notes. The second former employee, a maintenance worker named Tim, had more damning information. I overheard Richard Jr. talking to his father once, Tim explained in Marcus's office. They were discussing how to accelerate demographic transition in the West Side properties. Jr. suggested raising rents by 40% all at once. Senior said that would be too obvious. Better to evict for renovations than raise rents for new tenants. Marcus felt a familiar anger rise, but channeled it into focused questioning. Would you testify to this in court? Tim hesitated. I have kids, a mortgage. I understand, Marcus said, though disappointment washed through him. Another dead end. But the third interview changed everything. Patricia Gonzalez had been Richard Caldwell Sr.'s executive assistant for 8 years before being let go during the company transition to his son. I kept copies, she said simply, sliding a USB drive across the table. Emails, memos, tenant lists with his personal notes. He never thought I'd save them. Why did you? Marcus asked, hardly believing their luck. Patricia's eyes hardened. My sister was evicted from one of his buildings in 2017. 3 months after I started working for him. I didn't make the connection until later. That night, Marcus worked until dawn, combing through the files. There it was, the evidence they needed. Emails between father and son discussing tenant quality improvements and demographic adjustments. Spreadsheets tracking the racial composition of each building, with targets for reduction of Category B and C tenants. Marcus found his own family's name in one list from 12 years ago, marked for transition, along with the Johnsons, Riveras, and others. All families of color, all evicted within months of each other. The next morning, eyes red from lack of sleep but mind crystal clear, Marcus presented his findings to Mary and the firm's partners. With these documents, tenant testimonies, and our statistical analysis, we have enough for a class action lawsuit, he concluded. Not just for historical discrimination, but ongoing practices. The senior partners exchanged glances before Mary spoke. File the paperwork, she said. It's time. That afternoon, Marcus began drafting the lawsuit that would represent over 200 families affected by CalSTAR's discriminatory practices over the past 15 years. As lead counsel, he would personally face the Caldwells in court. That evening, he called his mother. "It's happening, Mom," he said quietly. "After all these years." "Are you sure you're ready?" Tanya asked, knowing how personal this was for him. Marcus looked at the old, important Pelan's notebook sitting open on his desk, its childish handwriting a reminder of how far he'd come. "I've been ready since I was 10 years old." The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters on the first day of Williams v. CalSTAR development. The case had attracted national attention, with headlines highlighting the scale of alleged discrimination spanning 15 years and affecting hundreds of families. Marcus walked up the steps in a perfectly tailored navy suit, flanked by Mary Rivera and their legal team. His expression remained composed despite the cameras and shouted questions. "Mr. Williams, is this case personal for you? Did you specifically target the Caldwell family? How you respond to CalSTAR's claims that this is a publicity stunt?" Marcus simply nodded politely and continued walking. This moment had lived in his imagination for over a decade. He wouldn't let anything distract him now. Inside the courtroom, Richard Caldwell Sr. sat beside his son at the defense table. At 65, the elder Caldwell's hair was now completely white, his face lined with age but still holding the same cold confidence Marcus remembered from childhood. Richard Jr., around 40, had his father's build but looked uncomfortable, constantly adjusting his tie. As Marcus arranged his documents at the plaintiff's table, he felt the elder Caldwell's eyes on him. There was no recognition in that gaze, just calculation, assessing this young attorney who dared challenge his empire. Judge Eleanor Patterson entered, and court was called to session. The opening statements would set the tone for everything to follow. Marcus stood, buttoned his jacket, and approached the jury. "This case is about patterns," he began, his voice clear and steady. "Patterns that reveal intentions. For 15 years, CalSTAR Development, formerly Caldwell Properties, has systematically removed families of color from their buildings. They used fake renovation claims, created impossible living conditions, or simply refused to renew leases. Each individual action might seem legitimate, but together, they tell a different story." Richard Sr. watched with narrowed eyes as Marcus displayed the first chart on a large screen, a map of the city with properties color-coded by demographic changes over time. "Notice how buildings owned by CalSTAR consistently show the same pattern: diverse residents out, white residents in. Not market trends, company policy." By lunchtime, Richard Sr. had leaned over to whisper something to his attorney, who looked grim in response. During the break, CalSTAR's legal team approached Marcus with an offer to settle. The amount was substantial, but included a confidentiality agreement. "We'll need time to consider," Marcus replied professionally, though he already knew his answer. The Caldwell's attorney, Thomas Bennett, smiled thinly. "Mr. Caldwell appreciates your enthusiasm, Mr. Williams, but feels this has gone far enough. He's prepared to be quite generous." "This isn't about money," Marcus replied. "It's about accountability." When court resumed, Marcus called his first witness, Patricia Gonzalez, the former executive assistant. She testified about the coded language used in company communications, explaining how quality improvements meant removing Black and Hispanic tenants. "Did Mr. Caldwell ever explicitly mention race in these discussions?" Bennett asked during cross-examination. "He didn't have to," Patricia replied. Everyone understood what Category C tenants meant. As the day ended, Richard Sr. finally approached Marcus directly in the courthouse hallway. "You're making a mistake, young man," he said quietly. "This case will drag on for years. Most of your plaintiffs will give up. Take the settlement." Marcus met his eyes steadily. "Mr. Caldwell, do you recognize me at all?" Caldwell frowned, studying Marcus's face more carefully. "Should I?" "Apartment 4B, October 2013. You evicted a nurse and her 10-year-old son." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the older man's face, quickly replaced by practiced indifference. I've owned hundreds of units. I don't remember individual tenants. That's part of the problem, Marcus replied. But I remembered you. Every day for 12 years. For the first time, Richard Caldwell Sr. seemed unsettled, looking at Marcus with new wariness. What do you want from this? Justice, Marcus answered simply. See you tomorrow, Mr. Caldwell. As Marcus walked away, he heard Richard Jr. ask his father, Who is he? The elder Caldwell's response was too quiet to hear, but his expression had changed from confidence to concern. That night, Marcus called his mother to report on the day's events. He didn't even remember us, Mom, he said. But he will now, Tanya replied softly. He certainly will now. The trial lasted for 3 weeks. Each day, the courtroom filled with former tenants of Caldwell properties, coming to witness what many had thought impossible, the powerful Caldwell family being held accountable. On the final day, the courthouse was packed beyond capacity. Reporters lined the hallways, and a crowd gathered outside, following the case that had become national news. Housing advocates from across the country had traveled to see the verdict. All rise, the bailiff called. Judge Patterson took her seat and surveyed the crowded courtroom. Before we hear closing arguments, I understand the defense has a statement. Thomas Bennett, the Caldwell's attorney, stood. Your Honor, after reviewing the evidence presented, my clients would like to propose a settlement agreement. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Marcus exchanged glances with Mary. This was unexpected after 3 weeks of fierce fighting. Judge Patterson raised an eyebrow. Proceed. Bennett outlined the terms. CalSTAR would establish a $20 million fund for affected families, create new anti-discrimination policies, and submit to 5 years of independent monitoring. When Bennett finished, Judge Patterson turned to Marcus. Counsel for the plaintiffs? Marcus stood slowly. This was the moment he had worked toward for more than a decade, the power to accept or reject the Caldwell's offer. He looked across the courtroom where both Caldwells sat, the elder man's face an unreadable mask, the younger one visibly nervous. Your Honor, we appreciate the offer. However, there's one element missing that my clients require: public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Richard Caldwell Sr.'s jaw tightened visibly. His son leaned over to whisper something, but the elder Caldwell shook his head firmly. Judge Patterson nodded. I'll give you 1 hour to negotiate. If no agreement is reached, we'll proceed with closing arguments. During the recess, Marcus sat in a small conference room with the Caldwells and their attorneys. The tension was thick enough to touch. $20 million isn't enough? Richard Jr. asked incredulously. This was never about money, Marcus replied evenly. It's about justice. What exactly do you want? The elder Caldwell demanded. A public apology. Admission that CalSTAR systematically discriminated against families of color, and your personal commitment to change. Richard Sr. scoffed. Absolutely not. That's admitting liability. That's admitting truth, Marcus countered. And without it, we continue to trial. As the hour neared its end, Richard Jr. finally spoke up against his father. Dad, we need to end this. The evidence, it doesn't look good. Something shifted in the elder Caldwell's eyes. Recognition that his son was right, that his empire was at risk. He studied Marcus with new respect. You've been planning this for a long time, haven't you? Marcus met his gaze steadily. Since I was 10 years old, watching my mother cry after you evicted us for no reason except the color of our skin. Silence filled the room. Then Richard Sr. nodded once. Fine, we'll do it your way. When court resumed, the settlement was announced, including the public acknowledgement of discrimination. As Judge Patterson reviewed the terms, the courtroom doors opened quietly. Tanya Williams slipped into a seat in the back row. Marcus hadn't told her to come. He hadn't been certain of victory, but somehow she knew. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and years of struggle passed between them in that glance. After the judge approved the settlement, reporters swarmed the steps outside. Richard Caldwell Sr. stood stiffly before the microphones, reading the prepared statement acknowledging his company's discriminatory practices and apologizing to those affected. As cameras flashed, Marcus stood to the side, watching not the Caldwells but the faces of former tenants in the crowd. Their expressions, some tearful, some smiling, all vindicated, were what truly mattered. Afterward, he found his mother waiting by his car. "You did it," Tanya said, embracing him tightly. "We did it," Marcus corrected. "Everything I am, everything I did, it started with you." As they pulled apart, Marcus noticed Richard Caldwell Sr. watching them from across the parking lot. Their eyes met one final time, the man who had once wielded his power carelessly and the boy who had grown up determined to balance the scales. Caldwell gave a small, acknowledging nod before turning away. That evening, Marcus finally opened the old, important Pelan's notebook to its last page. There, in a child's handwriting, were the words he had written 12 years ago. "Make sure it never happens again, to anyone." Below it, he added just 3 words. "Promise kept, Mom."